we're going to talk about the start and the end of a meeting. We will specifically talk about how important it is to start and end the meeting on time. Then we're going to talk about the beginning part of the meeting, how to provide context and introduce the topic, how to set it up right, kick it off well. And then lastly, how to end the meeting, wrapping it up by focusing on next steps, on key decisions. Kind of the start and the end of the meeting is the focus of this section and this next step. Unfortunately, most meetings start late. If you actually look at this data, and this data is from the University of Nebraska, where they did a study about meeting start times, and it turns out every second meeting starts late. They found that approximately half the meetings start on time, but then they found out that around 30 to 40% of meetings start at least 5 minutes late, and around, I think, 15% of meetings start more than 10 minutes late. So every 9th meeting or so starts more than 10 minutes late. That's quite surprising to me. And it's something that you as a meeting facilitator or meeting host should avoid. Starting late is really bad. It shows your attendees that you're not fully valuing their time. It reduces the time you actually have to discuss the important topics or to achieve what you're trying to achieve. If a 30-minute meeting starts 10 minutes late, you only have 20 minutes left, but then you have to end a bit earlier to wrap up. So you basically only have 15, 20 minutes in total. The same with if you start 5 minutes late. But the biggest point is people are already, they get bothered, they're in a bad mood. If the meeting starts 5 minutes late, they dial in, but then they have to wait and they're like, hey, let's get this going. I have other stuff to do. And if then there's a lot of chit chat in the beginning, people showing up late, it just sets the meeting up for not a successful ending. And so you want to start on time. If people dial in late, it's fine to start on time. And then when they dial in later, if they're important people, you could do a quick recap. Say, hey, thanks for joining, John. We've discussed the following topics and now we're at this topic. That's more effective than waiting for everybody to show up. If there's somebody really important that you need in the meeting that is not attending, you might have to wait. If the person doesn't show up within 5 minutes, it might be a good approach to postpone the meeting and cancel the meeting, which might be better than having a meeting with the wrong people and just dragging it on, but everybody kind of knowing we won't be able to make the final decision here. This is just initial discussions. So depending on the situation, if all the key stakeholders will be late, to fully postpone the meeting. Assuming you start on time, how should you think about for a 60-minute meeting, let's say, how should you think about the different sections of the meeting? I would think of it as there's an introduction part, then there's the middle part, here the gray part, topic 1, 2, 3, and then there's a wrap-up part. And the introduction and the wrap-up are really, really important. You might have heard this phrase of people only remember the beginning and the end of a presentation. That is definitely true. And the beginning and the end of a presentation or a meeting, they set the tone. They set the whole feeling of how people assess a meeting or the effectiveness of a meeting. So if you kick off well, if you have a great introduction, good context, clear agenda, clear objectives, and then you wrap it up well at the end, the meeting will probably be seen or perceived as successful. Even if the middle part was a bit off topic, maybe a bit heated. But if you wrap it up well, if you introduce it well, it's very likely that the meeting will still be perceived as successful. And you having done a good job at the meeting, at hosting the meeting, facilitating it. How would you kick it off well? What's a good introduction? I put down 5 minutes here, but I think a good introduction doesn't need to be 5 minutes. It's probably more 2 to 5, depending on how complex the topic is and how much context you need to provide. But before you jump into topic 1, topic 2, I would make sure that you talk about 3 things. Number 1, the context. So what's the context of this meeting? Is it part of a bigger project? Is it a follow-up meeting to a previous meeting? And mentioning that. We talked about the launch of this new product 2 weeks ago. This is a follow-up meeting. Or this meeting is a weekly meeting to provide updates on our project. The amount of context you need to provide depends on what type of meeting it is. If it's a meeting once a month where you update senior executives that are not fully aware of the project, you might need to provide a little bit more context. If it's a one-on-one, an informal catch-up, obviously you wouldn't start with the context. If in a coffee chat you wouldn't say, oh, we talked a month ago, now we're talking again. That would feel awkward, right? If it's a lot of people in the audience that are not fully aware of what's happening, you need to spend a little bit more time pre-wiring them and providing context. And then the next point is objectives. Being really clear about what is the big objective and actually stating it. So we talked last time about the product launch. We're coming here together again to make a final decision on when to launch product X. So that's the objective. And then the third point, so we talked about context and the main objective, and then agenda items or the structure of the meeting. Like the goal is to make a decision on the product launch when we're launching it. And then the how, like how are we going to achieve it, is by going through these 3 agenda items. Number 1, introducing the topic or introducing the current timeline, the current plan, discussing it, and then maybe deciding it at the end. Always starting with context, the main objective, and then the how, like how you're structuring the meeting. And here I have expectations as the 4th one. That's usually part of the agenda of like what is the expectation within it? What do I need from the audience? What does the host facilitator need? That's the introduction part, and that's really important. Setting the right scene, setting the scene to make sure everybody's clear on what the objectives are and is aligned on that these are the right objectives, that this is the way to conduct the meeting. It's quite helpful sometimes to ask a quick question at the end of the introduction before you jump into to ensure everybody is aligned. Like, are these the right objectives? Is there anything else we should discuss? Does this make sense? To get buy-in on the overall setting the scene part. And then you have the main part, you go through the topics, and then at the end you want to wrap up. And on the next slide, I want to talk more in depth about the wrapping up part. So the wrapping up is really critical, and it's not done properly most of the time. At the top here, I think key is to take ownership. As the meeting host or facilitator, is taking ownership to wrapping up meetings successfully. Because what happens, even with good hosts, is they kick it off well, then there is a lively discussion, we go through the agenda items, make maybe some decisions, and then the meeting just fades. And it's like, oh, we got 30 seconds left. Somebody says I got to hop. I have another meeting coming up, and then people just drop, and the meeting just fades out, and there isn't a nice conclusion to the meeting. And so, as a meeting host, you want to be the one that announces, hey, we're just having the understanding that you should take ownership to wrap it up successful. And the way I think you should do it is 5 minutes before the end. If it's a full day workshop, it could be half an hour before the end of the workshop, to announce that we're coming to an end. Being clear that now is the time to step back and move to the closing part of the meeting or the workshop. And then when you announce the meeting is coming to an end, assess whether it's possible or necessary to extend the meeting. Sometimes it might make sense to ask, hey, do people have 15 minutes more? Can we extend this meeting right now? If there are additional topics to discuss, additional agenda items that we haven't been able to complete. Most of the time, it's better to actually end the meeting and schedule another one, because people are, at least a few people will have back-to-back meetings. Most of the time, suboptimal to have a meeting with only half the people. And so, assuming you have to end the meeting, what you want to do in the last couple minutes is recap the meeting, recap decisions, and align on next steps. Even if it's a confusing meeting, even just stepping back and saying, okay, what are the next steps now? Like, what should we do to drive this topic forward? But stronger would be to say, okay, I think we've discussed the following, we've made these decisions, and I think we should do X, Y, and Z next. These are the 3 next steps. And then you want to do the last point here, share what you're doing after the meeting. announcing, communicating that you're going to send a follow-up meeting, that you're working on these topics. Could be I'm scheduling another meeting, or I'm sending a follow-up email, or if you're the only one owning next steps, it could also be that, saying I'm going to own these next steps. Is there anything else we should do? So this is a simple sequence of what you want to do at the end of the meeting. Like I said, you want to take ownership. That's important. Announcing, then deciding how you're going to use the last 5 minutes of the meeting. Optimally, you can recap the meeting, rehash, review the key decisions, and announce next steps, and then also share what you're going to do next after the meeting as part of the broader project, assuming it's part of a series or that there are big next steps. So what have we learned? Starting every meeting on time. We've learned that half the meetings don't start on time, and that it's important, especially with more senior folks, to not delay the start of the meeting. It's better to start on time and bring people up to speed if they dial in late, depending on their seniority or whether it makes sense in that context. Then to think about the start and the end of the meeting as really critical points of a meeting, having a good introduction, providing context, providing the objectives, agenda items, what's expected of people, and then wrapping up at the end, taking ownership, announcing that the meeting is coming to an end, and making sure that people are aligned on the next steps and what was decided in the meeting.